I'm now going to just hand over to Connor, and away you go. He's going to tell you all about his background. There you are.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you all for coming tonight. It's a pleasure to be here in such a beautiful building as well, talking about the creatures that I worship. Which of course tonight is Beetles. That's me. So generally you can find me about 90% of the time sat in a field, squatting somewhere, peering over a log, or a piece of poo in this case. I'm an ecologist by training, more specifically an entomologist, and probably more specifically a coleopterist, which is someone that studies beetles. So I first sort of came to know Rebecca because I used to work for the Royal Parks, and I did a lot of work in Bushy Park, and because Bushy Park is one of my favorite Royal Parks, where I would try and spend all of my time as much as I could. And whilst I was working there, I was really interested in trying to connect people with insects and beetles. When I first started, I was working on a project called Mission Invertebrate, which was all about trying to connect Londoners with insects. And in one of my final years in the parks, I wanted to do a citizen science project. So that's where you can get local people involved in collecting data, doing research, and helping to do some science. And I wanted to do a citizen science project on dung beetles, because I love dung beetles, they're one of my favorites, and I thought it's a really nice way of getting people to look at Bushy Park in a different way, at a different level. And because it was a citizen science project about dung beetles, I really wanted to call it Shitizen Science, but the Royal Parks, unfortunately, wouldn't allow me to do that. I can kind of understand why. So I then left the Royal Parks and I moved to a garden called Chelsea Physic Garden, where I was the head of learning, which is a really, really nice garden. I recommend you visit there if you haven't been there before. It's the oldest botanic garden in London. And I'm still kind of at Chelsea Physic Garden. I'm working there freelance, and I'm doing a biodiversity study of the garden. So it's the first biodiversity study that's ever been done in Chelsea Physic Garden. So I'm, again, often just squatting down, lifting over logs, and looking for bugs, which is my dream come true. So why did I become fascinated with beetles? I wasn't really interested in insects when I was a young kid. I was always into nature. My mum would always take me to Oxford Natural History Museum, which is the nearest museum to my house, because it was free. She could just dump me off there, and I would spend the day occupying myself looking at all the taxidermy and creatures. But I mainly got interested in insects when I was doing my undergraduate degree in zoology at the University of Southampton. And I met a lady called Christine Taylor, who was working at a local natural history museum in Winchester. They didn't have a proper museum, but they had a really nice collection of taxidermy, insects, plant specimens. And they needed volunteers to come and help digitize the collection, to type up all the labels, so they had a good catalogue of all the specimens that they had. So I volunteered and I went along thinking that I'd be working with taxidermy, animals or birds, and instead what they needed me to do was look at insects. And the first ever drawer that was put in front of me was a drawer of stag beetles, and I had to use my forceps and pick them up, take all the labels off, because each insect specimen in a museum often has a label which has where it was found, by who, which date, which location, which helps you kind of have a verifiable scientific record on every insect. And it kind of serves as like a record that you can then look and use in the future to see what species were found in this place in the past. So I was just working on stag beetles all day for a few weeks, and this first photo is one I took back then, just drinking tea and looking at beetles and putting new labels on them. And it really kind of made me appreciate insects, because mostly before then, when I've encountered insects, it's always been in my house, it's been almost feeling like an infestation or an invasion. So, and when you have that experience with insects, it's never a positive one. But then when I got to see all these insects up close, they're dead, they're not going to move, they're all pinned in nice positions, you really get to appreciate just how beautiful they are and how amazing all the little structures are on them, all the hairs are aligned in a certain way, all their little ridges, how shiny they are. So it really kind of, I don't know, unlocked something in my brain that really made me appreciate beetles. And so after that, I then started volunteering at Oxford Natural History Museum, which is where I spent my childhood working on their collection. And the person that I worked with there was a guy called Darren Mann, who was at the time the head of the entomology collection. And he was a dung beetle specialist. And he's someone that if you spend any time with, his enthusiasm rubs off. And I became really interested in dung beetles. So I would then go and spend all my weekends sifting through poo in Oxford, trying to find these sort of beautiful, shiny beetles. And I like to think that spending your time crouched down, looking in poo, gives you a really unique perspective on the world, because if you can find enjoyment in something so disgusting, I think you're never going to be bored in life. You're always going to be interested, because there's poo everywhere. So you're never going to be bored. Wash your hands before eating. What is a beetle? It's not that. Definitely not. What is a beetle? What isn't a beetle? We need to learn a little bit about taxonomy. The first thing we're talking about is the phylum. So all living things are ranked and organized in phylum, in kingdom, in order, in families, so that we can categorize all the different species and how they're related. At the most broadest sense, beetles are arthropods. This means a creature with an exoskeleton and with jointed legs. So that includes things like Chelicerata, which are spiders, ticks, mites. It also includes things like myriapods, which are centipedes and millipedes. Myriapod means many legs. And lastly, hexapods, which are insects. So hex means six legs. Insects have 6 legs, and that distinguishes them from things like spiders, things like millipedes, things like centipedes. And within hexapods, if we go down into the order level, we've got things like beetles, of course. The Latin name is Coleoptera. We've got Diptera, flies. Di means 2, ptera means wings, so 2 wings. We've got Hymenoptera, which are the bees, wasps, the ants, and the Lepidoptera, moths and butterflies, and several other orders for all the different insects. But I'm mainly going to talk about that one order, Coleoptera. So this is a beetle. This is a ground beetle, a violet ground beetle. And the word Coleoptera comes from the koleos, meaning sheath, and pteron, meaning wing. So sheathed wing. Now, all insects originally had 2 pairs of wings. Some insects have then lost or changed some of that combination. With beetles, they have 1 pair of wings, which is a hard sheath, a wing case, and then 1 pair of flight wings. So that's how they've become modified. And that's what is quite distinctive with beetles. And the word beetle itself comes from the Old English for bitan, which means little biter. And again, the mouth parts of beetle are really distinctive. Beetles have got biting or chewing mouth parts, whereas other types of insects don't. So bugs, for example, true bugs, shield bugs, they've got a long tube-like mouth, and they drink liquid, like sap, for example. Flies have got various different types of mouths. Flies either have piercing mouths, or they have mouths that are kind of like a sponge, and they can absorb liquid. But beetles are generally, other than wasps and ants, the only ones that have got chewing mouth parts. The other thing that's really distinctive about beetles is their life cycle. They all undergo complete metamorphosis. And that's similar to a butterfly, where you have a distinct separation between the larva and the adult stage. So if you think about a butterfly, you've got egg, which hatches into a caterpillar, which then turns into a chrysalis, which then turns into the adult butterfly. And the caterpillar and the butterfly are very different, and that's called complete metamorphosis. And beetles do a very similar thing. They have an egg which hatches into a larva. They'll then go into a pupal stage, which is kind of like a chrysalis, and then turn into the adult beetle, which has got legs. That's complete metamorphosis. A lot of insects don't do that, though. So things like grasshoppers, they don't have that. They have incomplete metamorphosis, where an egg hatches into basically a tiny little grasshopper, and as it sheds its exoskeleton several times, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So that's called incomplete metamorphosis. And things like bugs or shield bugs, which are often mistaken for beetles, they have incomplete metamorphosis. So they're born into a little tiny shield bug, which kind of gets bigger and bigger and bigger, sometimes changing color, but it doesn't have that drastic difference between a larva and an adult stage. Now, if we look at the body of a beetle, the other thing that's very distinctive is how its wings join each other at rest. You can see down the center, there's a line, and when its two wing cases join together, they come together and form a nice line, and that's really distinctive of a beetle. Versus a shield bug, which wings overlap in a cross, so that's really distinctive. So if you see something that looks beetly, have a look at the wings. Do its wings cross when they meet each other, or do they meet down a flat line? You can see a distinctive flat line. And that's the best way of determining if it's a beetle or if it's a bug or something else. So now that you can hopefully identify what is a beetle, what is not a beetle, how many are there? In the UK, here are some of the top insect groups. We've got things like Diptera, the flies, where there's about 7,000 different types of fly in the UK. There's about 2,500 butterflies and moths in the UK. Of that, I think only about 60 are butterflies and about 2,400 moths. The Hymenoptera, that's the bees, the wasps, the ants, about 7,600, and the Hemiptera, the true bugs, about 1,800. With beetles, we've got about 4,000 beetles in the UK, which is quite a good chunk. And just as a comparison, as I said, there's about 60 species of butterfly and about 600 species of birds. So, insects far outnumber all other groups of living creatures. But how about on a global scale? So, on a global scale, in terms of the number of described species that are recognized by science, there's actually a lot more beetles, about 400,000 different described species of beetle in the world, vastly outnumber all other groups. Although some entomologists will argue that there are a lot more wasps than there are beetles in the world. It's just that most of the wasp species haven't yet been identified by science. So if you want to name a new species, either go for a beetle or go for a wasp in the tropics somewhere in the middle of a rainforest. You'll probably find a new species. So quite a diverse group of insects, quite an interesting one to study. So we mentioned this. So with 4,000 described species, that makes up around 25% of all known animal life forms. A quarter of all species in the world, 1 in every 4 species, is a beetle. So they're a real substantial group of living creatures. And they do so many jobs like pollination. They help to recycle rotting wood, dung, dead animals. They're also food for so many species. So let's talk about some of the sort of the charismatic species that you might commonly find in Bushy and Home Park. Of course, we've got the greater stag beetle. Now, there are 2 species of stag beetle you'll find in the parks here. You have the greater stag beetle, which is this one, which is where you have quite a distinct difference between males and females. You have males that have these big mandibles that they use for fighting each other, almost like the stags do in rutting time. The stag beetles do a similar thing when they're competing for a female. Now, because they're such a big, charismatic beetle, they have a lot of folklore that's associated with them, and this is some of their sort of common names that they have. Billy Witch, face catcher, because if you've ever seen a stag beetle fly, they're not great flyers. They're sort of all over the place, and they might fly into your face. Horse pincher, because they thought they would go up to horses and bite their legs. thunder beetles, and there's a lot of link between thunder and stag beetles. So in Germany, for example, the stag beetle was associated with the Thor, the god of thunder, and there was a myth that if there was a storm, you could place a stag beetle under your hat, and that would protect you from lightning, which I would not recommend. There was also this idea that the stag beetles actually summoned thunder and lightning, so medieval peasants were quite scared of stag beetles. And there's also this belief that stag beetles would carry lumps of coal that were lit and fly into people's thatched roofs and start fires. So there was this belief that these stag beetles were somehow arsonists as well. But they kind of do look a bit devilish, don't they? So I can understand the superstition, perhaps. But they've got really incredible life cycles. So after the stag beetles mate, the female will go and lay eggs underneath a bit of rotting wood. And what they really need is standing dead wood. So a dead tree which has died and is still standing, still partially buried underground. That's the habitat they need. So they lay their eggs. Those eggs hatch into these larvae. And these larvae take around 3 to 7 years to become mature and to build up enough fat reserves to then turn into an adult, because the adult beetle doesn't actually really feed. It just lives on fat reserves. And the reason it takes so long is because dead woods are really not a very nutritious material to eat. There's not much value in sort of cellulose, so it takes a long time for them to digest it and produce enough fat. Now these larvae are called C-shaped larvae because they look like the letter C, and they're really distinctive of scarab beetles. All scarab beetles have this shaped larva that look very similar. So often people find what looks like a stag beetle larva under their lawns or in a plant pot or under sort of logs. It may not be a greater stag beetle larva, but it definitely would be a scarab beetle of some sort. Now there's also the lesser stag beetles. So the greater stag beetle is really big, and we also have the lesser stag beetle. This isn't to scale. The lesser stag beetle is at least half the size of the greater stag beetle. So this is the greater stag beetle on this side, and this is the lesser stag beetle. And in the lesser stag beetle, the males and females don't look very different. The male's head is slightly wider, but the one distinguishing feature on the female, if you do find these, and these are much more commonly found than the greater stag beetle, is that on top of the female's head it has 2 little bumps. And that's the best way of determining if it's a male or a female stag beetle. And these stag beetles you'll find under logs. So if you roll over a log, you might find these quite commonly, whereas the greater stag beetle you wouldn't really find under a log. It will be buried underground. And of course the reason that Bushy Park has such an amazing population of stag beetles is because of all the really old trees, all the old dead woods. Out of interest, hands up if you've seen a stag beetle in this area before. Great, yeah, it's pretty amazing. There's very few parts of the UK that would have such a high percentage of people that have seen a stag beetle. I've seen a lot in Bushy Park that are partially eaten by magpies, and you just find the adults sort of crawling away with half their body missing out, which is unfortunate. But yeah, so the stag beetles are on decline within the UK because people are tidying up their gardens. There's not as much dead wood, rotting wood around, so they are sort of declining. But obviously this Bushy Park, because it was a royal park, because it was enclosed, it has a lot of really old oak trees, so it is very good habitat. So moving on, one of the other things that makes Bushy Park is, of course, all the hawthorn trees. And hawthorn trees are also really good for beetles. I think Bushy Park was supposedly named Bushy Park because it had such a high number of these bushy hawthorn trees. So it is a very iconic tree for the parks, and there's a lot of them. And what's really good about hawthorn is that it becomes an ancient tree fairly soon. So oak trees can take 400 to 600 years before they become sort of ancient. And they have these fissures and cracks and rotting bits, which are really good for beetles. Whereas hawthorn trees, they can get to that sort of state within 200 years. So they're a bit faster in their life and death, which means that there's more rotting wood available. And there was a study in the park, and they found that about 400 species of invertebrate can be supported by hawthorn trees. And one of my favorite ones that's supported by hawthorn is this beetle here, which is called a cardinal click beetle. Cardinal because of the color red, which cardinals wear. And it's a click beetle because of this video here. It has this amazing mechanism that allows it to kind of latch itself and then sort of stretch this part of its body, which then can release and click and flick it up as a way of escaping predators. So if you ever try and find these, and you have them in your hand, they just sort of pop and disappear somewhere. But they're called saproxylic beetles. Saproxylic beetles are beetles that feed and depend on rotting wood. So it's a really, really important habitat for beetles. Lots of beetles depend on rotting wood. And in terms of rotting wood in general, around 2,000 types of invertebrate can be depend upon dead wood. So it's a really valuable resource and something that's maybe not appreciated as much because it just feels like it's rubbish. And in the past, lots of trees would have been put through a wood chipper and taken away. But now there's much more of an effort to leave a lot of rotting wood where it is because it's really good habitat. Now, I don't know if anyone's ever seen one of these. These are some of my favorite beetles. I saw quite a few last summer in Bushy Park. These are called acorn weevils. And as the name would suggest, they live on acorns. And so often I find these on the leaves of oak trees in the sort of early summer when acorns are developing. And you'll notice a really long nose called a rostrum on this beetle. And at the end of that long nose is its mouth. And essentially, it uses it to gnaw a hole or tunnel through to the center of the acorn. And then it has an ovipositor, almost like a needle-like structure at its butt that it uses to then lay the egg deep into the acorn. And then here is the larva that would then be developing inside of the acorn. And so you see that you'll often find acorns that will have these little holes in them, and that's created by this little acorn weevil. And I just think they're really cute. And what's really distinctive about weevils is their antenna. They have these quite distinctive clubbed antenna, almost like a elbowed antenna, and these really big eyes. And weevils are actually one of the most diverse groups within beetles. In the UK, we've got around 900 weevil species. They're quite a complicated group. And they're so diverse because they are associated, they're often very specific to certain plants. And as those plants have evolved, the weevils have also evolved with them, which has led to the speciation of lots of different species of weevil. Now, one of my favorite things about the parks are also all the birds, because they actually provide an amazing habitat for beetles, believe it or not. But mainly their corpses when they die. So these are some beetles I found a year or two ago when I found a dead crow. And being an entomologist, whenever I see a dead thing, I'm like, what could be inside of it? So I shook this dead crow over a tray, and these two beetles popped out. And these are called burying beetles, or necrophorus. And they specialize in living inside of dead animals. They're really amazing. But they have this amazing mechanism of dealing with dead animals and corpses. Because if you imagine when something dies, it starts to rot, it starts to produce smells, it'll start to attract flies. And if you're using that as a food source, then you're in real big competition with lots of other things that are trying to eat it. Foxes, lots of things are looking for that to scavenge. So you need to evolve ways of concealing it. And the name, as the name would suggest, they're called burying beetles. And so these beetles often will find a mouse or a small bird. You'll have a male and a female that will meet on it. They'll then mate, and they'll form this pair bond. And they'll then work together to do something really amazing. Firstly, what they do is they strip all of the fur off of the mouse, and then they start to bury it underground. They go underneath it, and then move the earth out to the side, so eventually it just looks like it's sinking into the ground. They then produce this antibiotic substance and coat the mouse in this antimicrobial substance so that to kill all the bacteria on it, so to slow the decomposition of the mouse. They'll then make a little hole in it, which would be their kind of entry hole, and they'll lay their eggs in it. And the eggs will then hatch into larvae, and what's really amazing is that the parents then hand feed their larvae. They chew up bits of mouse, and then mouth feed it to their babies, almost like birds in a nest, begging to their parents for food. But instead of birds, they're beetles, and the nest is a dead mouse, and the parents are feeding them bits of dead mouse. There's something that's really kind of disgusting and beautiful and poetic about that. And the reason it's really amazing is because parental care is really uncommon in the insect kingdom, in the insect world. There's very few examples of things that have parental care. Mostly insects lay eggs, and that's it. The parents will leave, they'll often die, and the larvae are left to deal with it with life by themselves. Yet these parents have this pair bond, and they'll stay, they'll look after the house, they're really territorial, so they'll keep all the flies away, keep everything else away, and nurture this brood of larvae. They'll feed them all independently until they then turn into pupa, and then eventually turn into adults, and they'll then fly off and find their own corpse to call home. They're just really amazing beetles. And there's a few different species, and there's one that's a big black one, and they've given them all nicknames. And this big black burying beetle is called the Undertaker. And it feels kind of relevant to talk about it in a room like this. So these are burying beetles, really incredible beetles. So next time you do see a dead mouse, a dead bird, give it a flick. Or just watch and see, because sometimes you'll start to see them move. And you'll say, why is the dead mouse moving? You wait long enough, you may get a nice surprise. The only thing I would say is that they smell disgusting. Even if you put them in a pot full of ethanol or something, the smell doesn't leave. Even if you pin them and dry them, they really do smell. So be warned. Now, there's a few other beetles that are more commonly seen and in less disgusting circumstances, you could argue. This is a longhorn beetle. I think it's called a spotted longhorn. And it's often found on flowers. A good place to see it is in Bushy Park, in the pheasant tree plantation. There is lots of little wildflower patches in the center between the two paths that run through the pheasant tree. And I often find them on there in the summer. And they're actually quite good pollinators. Beetles don't get much credit for being pollinators, but they are the original pollinators before bees are on the scene. So when flowering plants were first evolving, it was beetles that did a lot of the pollinating. And one of the first flowers to evolve a relationship with insects was magnolia. And magnolia flowers are really well adapted to be pollinated by beetles because it was before bees were around. And the way that it would work is that the flower is really big and fleshy. It's quite a thick petals, magnolia. And the reason is that when the flower would open, beetles would fly in, or they would crawl up the stems into the flower to feed on pollen, and often the flower would warm up a bit to try and attract them in. The flower would then close overnight and trap the beetles inside, And during that time, the beetles would be going crazy, trying to find a way out. But in doing that, they'd be covered by pollen. Then in the morning, the magnolia flower would open up, the beetles would crawl out or fly out, and they go to another flower and then release that pollen onto that flower. So originally flowers were very thick petals, and often would open and close to trap the beetles inside, before there was this more advanced relationship with bees and wasps. Beetles really are the original pollinators, and a lot of them still do feed on pollen, such as this longhorn beetle. And the way you can recognize this is probably mimicking a wasp or something like that. But longhorn beetles have got very long antennae, as the name would suggest, and so that's a good way of trying to recognize if it's a longhorn beetle. But yeah, definitely keep your eye out for this when the wildflowers start coming out. Does anyone know what this is? This is actually probably one of the most common beetles you will see. It's always going to be in your houses. People are often confused what it is. I think because I'm an entomologist, people often send me photos of bugs, Rebecca included, just saying, and they're saying, what is this? What is this? The number of times I've been sent a photo of one of these and been, what is this? If I had £1 for every one of these photos I'd be quite rich. I actually had a friend that worked at a Sainsbury's supermarket, and he sent me this, and he said, what is this? They're everywhere, and we're worried we might have to close the store, Sainsbury's supermarket, because they thought it was cockroaches. And I said, oh no, this is just a ladybird. So this is the larva of the ladybird, and they were so relieved because they thought they were going to have to close the Sainsbury's supermarket because there was a cockroach infestation. But no, they're harmless, they're ladybirds. Specifically, this is the larva of the harlequin ladybird, which is a species which is not native to the UK. It's from Asia, and it was introduced into greenhouses, commercial greenhouses, to eat aphids, because ladybirds are really good at eating aphids, so they're a gardener's best friend. But obviously in commercial greenhouses, lots of aphids. For some reason, I don't know exactly why, they brought in a non-native species to do it, and of course it then became naturalized and escaped. It's now pretty much the most common ladybird you would see, and it's called harlequin ladybird because it's very changeable. These are all the color forms of the harlequin ladybird, and the problem is that it has lots of color forms that look identical to our native ladybirds, so it's really hard to distinguish if it's a native ladybird or a harlequin ladybird. But the larva is quite distinctive. They've got these kind of parallel lines down their body, and it almost looks like an L shape. So that's really distinctive in the larva, but as an adult, it's really hard to identify what species it is. But it was first found in about 2004, so it's only quite a recent issue. The other thing that the harlequin ladybird does, why it's not great, why it's now the most common one, is that it actually eats the eggs and larvae of our native ladybirds as well. So it's not a great one. But what I'm really interested in, as someone that spends a lot of time trying to convince people that beetles are worth caring about, is that some beetles have somehow become okay. I think ladybirds are kind of one of those insects that has become acceptable to be okay with. And I think it's really interesting, the story of how we came to appreciate ladybirds. And it links back to the Middle Ages, where we have the Virgin Mary, who was known as Our Lady at the time. This is more sort of Catholicism. And generally, the Virgin Mary was painted in the color blue at the time, because blue was a very expensive fabric and associated with sort of really high status. But Leonardo da Vinci made this famous painting, the Madonna of the Carnation, where the Virgin Mary was clothed in red fabric, which was a controversial thing at the time and quite a new thing. But it became quite symbolic because it was sort of depicting the blood of Christ. And there was also this kind of fascination with the number 7. It was a very holy number. I think it was 7 joys or 7 sorrows. And then you have this red ladybird with 7 spots, which at the time would have been the most common native ladybird. And they called it Our Lady's Bird in the Middle Ages. And it was thought to be a bringer of joy, and it was bad luck to harm one. But of course, it wasn't called a bug, because that's gross, so it was Our Lady's Bird, which then became ladybird, or your American ladybug. And what's really interesting to me is that, does anyone know what the collective noun for a group of ladybirds is? So it's a loveliness of ladybirds. So it's really interesting how some beetles are so sort of disgusting and gross, and yet some beetles which kind of are very similar are somehow very warmly loved and appreciated. And it's all to do with, I guess, culture and, but I love them all. Now, you'll all be very, very familiar, of course, with all the deer that are found in the parks. And I like the deer because they obviously provide a really good habitat for some types of beetle. And, of course, this is the red deer, the biggest deer. So the male red deer is a stag. The female is called the hind. How do you know if you've seen a female deer? That's hindsight. That was a joke. But having these large mammals really does open up a really good habitat for another assemblage of beetles, and my favorite beetles, which of course are the dung beetles. And dung beetles have a number of different groups and of how they're identified. I'll talk about a few of them here. So the first group of dung beetles that we have are called dwellers. So if you find a big patch of poo, big clump, you'll have a lot of beetles that just live within that clump. They don't roll it, they don't dig tunnels anywhere, they'll just dig through the dung, and that's where they'll spend their life. They'll lay their eggs there, they'll eat it, and they're called dwellers. And they're often quite small, about 5 millimeters long, and they're the most common beetles you'll find. So if you go into the parks and you lift up a big bit of dung, or you split it in half, you'll see tunnels all going through it that were made by dung beetles, and sometimes you'll find the dung beetles themselves. So commonly we find lots of dwellers, but we also have some tunnelers. So these are beetles which, when they find a patch of dung, they dig a tunnel directly underneath it, and then they'll drag balls of dung down into their tunnels. Inside each one of those balls of dung, they'll lay an egg. The egg will then hatch and then eat all the dung. People say, why are they eating poo? Well, in herbivore poo, they're kind of just eating grass a second time around. A lot of animals, if you think about rabbits, for example, rabbits often eat their poo several times over because there's still lots of nutrients and food to be absorbed in it. So dung beetles are just doing the same thing. Now, the last group of dung beetles, and the one that's kind of most characteristic of dung beetles, are called the rollers. And we actually don't have any species that roll in the UK. There used to be technically one species that did roll, but it went extinct. But if you go to the Mediterranean, the tropics, you'll see lots of dung beetles rolling. I was in Spain not too recently, and there's this amazing sand dune complex, and lots of people ride their horses along the sand dune, and there was just loads of dung beetles flying in and then rolling all this dung balls away and then burying it down in the sand. But dung beetles are really important for our economy. So it's estimated that dung beetles save the UK cattle industry around £350 million a year in the services that they provide. If you have ever had horses, for example, often people will pick up all the horses' dung, putting it in a pile or take it away. But actually, dung beetles, if you had a really good balanced ecosystem in a big enough space, dung beetles would do all that job for you. They would break it all down. And by tunneling all through the dung and breaking it up, it allows fungi to come in and also start to break it up much faster. So dung beetles are really important for farming and agriculture. And often, if farmers start giving their animals worming medication, it can kill all the dung beetles that they're feeding on that dung, and then they have to then spend even more money then going and clearing up all the dung because they've killed the dung beetles. So they're really important for the ecosystem. And so because they're kind of an indicator of ecosystem health, I really wanted to do a study looking at the dung beetles in Bushy. A few years ago, one of my friends did the study in Richmond Park, and so we wanted to repeat the same for Bushy Park. So what we did is we went to put a lot of traps around the park. So it was over about a year. We had lots of volunteers. I think we had about 90 volunteers. I know some people are here today that came and helped us carry buckets of poo around Bushy Park. I mean, we then dug these holes. We put these pint glasses underground to act as pitfall traps. We suspended some poo on top, and then we came back a week later to see what we had caught. And we used a mix of horse dung on some traps and deer dung on other traps because some dung beetles are really specific for the type of poo they want to eat, and some are more generalist. And then we also went around and hand-searched a lot of poo. So again, a lot of time crouched over poo, looking at it, trying to find beetles. And you find these sort of glimmers inside big bits of deer poo, which are the dung beetles. And when we come back a week later and we check the traps, this is kind of the scene that we're confronted with, a nice murky liquid filled with tiny little beetles, which we then need to go back and identify under the microscope and determine what species there are. And in the end, we found about 24 species of dung beetle in Bushy Park, which was the same as Richmond Park. There were some species that were different, but kind of a similar assemblage. But what was really interesting is that, firstly, the most common beetle we found was this one here. It's about 5 millimeters long. It's called Melanopterus fasciolatus. It's pretty much the most common dung beetle in the UK. So if you lift over any bit of poo in the UK, you'll probably find these sort of brownish beetles. So that wasn't very surprising. The other dung beetle that's really common in Bushy Park is this one here. Has anyone seen this beetle in Bushy Park? A few of you. So this is the Minotaur beetle. It's quite a big beetle. It's probably, this is a centimeter here. So it's about 2 centimeters long, quite a big beetle. Often in the autumn times, you find them wandering along the paths in Bushy Park. And they'll often feed on any dung that is like pelleted, so rabbit dung or deer dung in small balls. And they'll then find those balls and they'll dig underground a tunnel and pull them down. So you often find them digging or you find them wandering around. But they're called Minotaur beetles after the Minotaur, the half man, half bull, because of their amazing horns. This is the male, the female doesn't have them. Now we knew this beetle was here before we started the study because I'd often see them when I'm walking around. But this one here was quite a surprise because this one here is only often found in cow dung and really big bits of dung. Often the bigger the dung, the more species you can get. And there's some species you're only going to find in really big bits of dung. So we weren't sure we were going to find it. But it was during the summer, I was looking into the distance and I saw the biggest bit of dung I've ever seen in Bushy Park. It was obviously a really big red deer that just passed through and left this absolutely massive pile of poo. And I saw it from a distance, it was almost like an anthill mound. It was huge. And so I went over and I turned it over and there was a really big tunnel, almost like the width of my finger, that was going through the dung. And then directly underneath there was a tunnel under the dung going down. And again, they're about the width of your finger. And so I got my trowel out and I started digging down. And sometimes these tunnels can go down a meter deep. They really do dig really deep depending on the soil. Thankfully, about 15 centimeters down, I felt a little bump. I thought, well, here's obviously a beetle, and managed to get it out, and it was this species. So what's really interesting is that often a lot of conservation programs now are talking about introducing cattle into parks, things like that. The problem with reintroducing cattle into spaces is that if you don't have the big dung beetles, like this one here, to break it down, often conservation projects will rear these dung beetles and then import them into an area, because without these big dung beetles, you can't have big animals. So the fact that we've got these really big dung beetles in the Bushy Park it's probably only because of the big red deer stags that they can survive. So they need really big bits of poo. I've got a joke. Do you want to hear a dung beetle joke? Okay. A dung beetle walks into a bar, and he says, "Is this stool taken?" Another dung beetle walks into the bar, and the bartender says, "Why the long feces?" It's not as good. Not as good. I'll move on. So this is these big sort of dung beetles are often called door beetles. The other name for them are Dumbledore, which is where the sort of Harry Potter name probably comes from. They're also called door flies or lousy watchmen, which is interesting. And they're probably called lousy watchmen because sometimes when you find dung beetles, big ones, they're covered in mites, these little creatures here. So mites are little tiny arachnids. And they're known as phoretic mites. And that means mites that are basically hitchhiking. So these mites feed on fly eggs, but they hitchhike on the back of dung beetles from dung pat to dung pat, and then hop off and then go eat all the fly eggs. So probably why one of the old common names was lousy watchman is to do with that lousiness, that kind of, because it's covered in little lice-like things. And watchman is an old English word for something that's kind of bumbling along. So often beetles were called clocks. There's a lot of beetles that are known as like green clocks or black clocks. And clock, again, is another old British word for something that's bumbling along. I'm sure a few of you can relate to that. So these are door beetles. The other thing I love about dung beetles is if you really do get them and look up close. I mentioned earlier about the fact that when they're dead and pinned, you can kind of see all the amazing details and hairs. Dung beetles actually have really incredible eyelashes that I think that quite a few of us would probably be quite jealous of. Yeah. So when you are out in the parks, these are things you need to look out for to find dung beetles. So this is a dung beetle burrow. Again, it's about the width of my finger, and you can always put your finger in, and you can then feel the burrow go down. And it can go down quite far, actually. Sometimes it's way too far to be able to dig down. But often, these are really common in a lot of the parks. You see them especially in the autumn time. And then again, if you see a patch of poo that's quite big, you can flip it over, and often it could have these sort of big beetles underneath it. So it's worth keeping your eye out, because they're kind of something interesting to see in the autumn time. Now, I'll talk a little bit about some of the other dung beetles I found across other royal parks. So a few years ago, we had some sheep that we brought into Green Park in London, and the sheep were only there for, I think, 5 days, but obviously they left some deposits, and I went round to have a look, and I found 5 species of dung beetle right outside Buckingham Palace, which is my claim to fame, because they're probably just feeding on a lot of the horse poo, horses that often go through that area. But yeah, there's probably a lot of other feces coming from Downing Street pretty much nearby. The other thing that links to dung beetles in some of the royal parks are in Brompton Cemetery, which is an amazing cemetery. There's this catacomb by Lady Hannah Courtoy, and it's an amazing Victorian catacomb, and the Victorians are often obsessed by Egyptian sort of themes and the afterlife. And this tomb is covered in sort of carvings of dung beetles carrying the sun. I think it's really interesting, again, when you think about ancient Egypt history and beliefs, and there was this idea that there was this sun god that was depicted as a scarab beetle. The idea being they would watch these scarab beetles rolling these balls of dung across the desert, and it was almost like how the sun would move across the sky. So there was this kind of association with the day and the sun and with dung beetles, which is what I enjoy. So I feel like if I was in ancient Egypt, I would have been worshipping the dung beetles as well. Now, this is not in Bushy Park, but this is a dung beetle that I found in Malaysia that feeds on elephant dung. but it's kind of the size of a hamster. And I was in a sort of rainforest research station, and I was just having a shower, and I heard this amazing buzzing sound. It was the loudest sort of buzzing I've ever heard. And I looked up, and there was this massive dung beetle just flying into the shower in the bathroom, which probably says something about the state of the bathroom, if it was attracting dung beetles. But I do sometimes wish, like, if we had these here, it'd be quite an amazing sight. Now, that's the end of my my talk, but I want to leave with one quote, which I think is particularly relevant given where we are tonight. In the 1920s, there was an evolutionary biologist called J.B.S. Haldane who wrote that on the fact of, what we talked about tonight, that if you were to judge the creator by their creation, it would appear that they have an inordinate fondness for beetles, which I think is quite relevant because they are such an amazing group, incredibly diverse, incredibly important, and actually quite easy to find if you don't mind getting your hands dirty. But thank you very much.